What is Asynchronous Apex and how do I use it? Today we explore common Asynchronous Apex use cases with a Salesforce architect, Niki Vankerk. Welcome to 100 Days of Trailhead, where the tech community comes to learn Salesforce, learn tech, get inspired, and invest in ourselves. We are your trail guides, here to support you on your learning journey. We release videos weekly. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a video. In the description below, you can find links for everything we mention in this video, as well as books and resources we found useful. Visit our blog, 100daysoftrailhead.com, for other helpful Salesforce and tech content. Asynchronous Apex is a great way to assist with user efficiency and can help you create scalable solutions to everyday issues. Niki Vankerk will explore Asynchronous Apex and how to handle these exceptions. Niki has been working with Salesforce technology since 2002. She has grown with the platform and has built her career helping companies make the most of their investment. She loves helping others to learn about what is possible and loves to get creative to meet their requirements with low-cost solutions. Niki especially likes mentoring and teaching women to succeed in technology, in business, and in life.
A little bit more about me, I guess I have my own consulting business, and I have since 2004 in Salesforce. I've been around the block with them a long time. Things have changed a lot. I do have both my application architect and system architect. I've been sort of working towards a CTA over the last year or so. It's pretty much on hold right now with everything else going on. And I'm a partner as well since 2007. So I know a lot about Salesforce, and I'm really excited to share the things that I do know. And I've coached, as Jessica said, I've coached RAD, I'm not sure how many times, I think 4 or 5 times, and done the part 2 a couple of times. And just want to say thank you to Melissa, I know you're on, and everyone that's involved in organizing RAD. I think it's an awesome program. When I started learning to code, I guess it was around 2007 when Apex and Visualforce came out, I thought, oh God, what is this? I'm just going to stick with the declarative. And then it took me about a year to realize, okay, this thing is hanging around here in this code. There's a lot I can't do, but I can see how I could if I could write triggers, and I could write Visualforce pages. And so I started learning how to code. I have a math background, so it wasn't totally foreign to me, but I hadn't, not a lot of HTML and not a lot of, anyway, I just needed to start picking it up. And so I did a lot of Googling back then. They didn't have Trailblazer communities and all the stuff that we have now. They had a developer forum that you could ask questions. I had like 2 guys that I kind of knew that I felt like I could probably ask them maybe 1 or 2 questions a month without being super irritating. So I would just hang on to those 2 questions until I really was stuck. And anyway, I'm so pleased to be able to help with some of this content and be able to help people figure things out faster. And also so cool that Rachel and Jessica started this WIT group with developers, so we can see other women who are good at coding and are interested in helping other women, because I do feel like there's something special about an all-woman support and seeing the people teaching and seeing people learning, and I just think it's a really cool place. So I'm always happy to help whenever I can. So today we're going to talk about Asynchronous Apex, what that is and why we care, and then some of the more familiar ways of having automations run asynchronously, and then a little bit about exception handling, what to do if there's problems when there's things running when you're not watching. And if you have questions along the way, I don't think I have enough content to fill the full time, so you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. I can stop anytime, so let me know. So asynchronous, I guess I didn't think about defining what that means. I figured people would know, but why don't I just say, so when you are working in Salesforce and you click the save button and you happen to have, let's say, a process builder that's running and doing something, or workflow rules that are running, or triggers that are looking up, the contacts account to find something, whatever, all of that is running synchronously. It's all running in one transaction. And there's a bunch of limits because we all share the resources with Salesforce. They put limits on how much you can do, how much transactions time you're allowed, queries you're allowed, and all of that. And if you go beyond that in one transaction, you get shut down. So some of the things you want to do synchronously. You want the person to see the result When they hit save, they want it right away. They need to see it. So there's definitely things you want to do right away. But there's a lot of stuff, more than you think, that you could run asynchronously. So asynchronously means that your change, your save, whatever you're doing, triggers something to happen, but it queues it up. And Salesforce will get to it when they have time, basically. So the very next time there's time you get in a list, your job starts to run. So it doesn't happen in the same transaction. It's got a separate transaction, which means it has different limits and higher limits, and doesn't take into account all the other things that your synchronous save might have already done. Now you're in a separate transaction, new limits and higher limits. So that's what I mean by asynchronous Apex. It's running in a different transaction than what you've just done to trigger whatever it is that you want to be done. So some of the reasons why it's more efficient. So I don't know if you've ever had, I know I have a client which I have to deal with, where you click on save for an opportunity that just been won, and then you can go have a coffee because it's creating, I don't know, a renewal opportunity. It creates a license, goes and calls out, does a key, all this stuff is going on, and it's taking a really long time. So if there's stuff that you can move out of the synchronous transaction, it's faster for the end user to finish and continue on with what else they want to do. It also is more scalable in general because, like I said, you're queuing up things, and as soon as a resource is ready, then it will pick up your job. And so we can have more jobs waiting rather than people not being able to process what they need. I mentioned that you can do more within your one transaction. So some of the big winners, you know, if you've ever seen the 101 SOQL limit before, instead of the 100 SOQL queries in one transaction, now you can do 200. For asynchronous, you get double the heap size. You can go 6 times longer with the CPU, which is just how long your transaction's allowed to spin. So there's a whole bunch of limits that are higher. With the scheduled Apex, you can schedule things to happen later. If you don't need someone to push a button and start something, you can just schedule, you know, nightly jobs to clean data or whatever it is, and it can happen on a schedule. So you're not watching it, and that's considered asynchronous as well. And then also, a big one for integrations, if you're doing call outs to other systems, those cannot be done in a synchronous transaction. You're not allowed to, because if you think about it, you're starting your transaction, you're holding, you know, cursors being held, and then we call out to their system. I have an example where we're looking for an exchange rate, and I'll show you. So you call out, waiting, give me back my exchange rate, waiting. Who knows what's happening there? And in the meantime, you're holding on to this cursor, this, you know, this transaction's open in Salesforce. They don't want that because they can't control what's happening on the call out side. So any call out you have to do has got to be asynchronous. And I'll show you an example of that. So those are some big reasons why. And generally when I'm talking to clients about, oh, I want this automation, do this and this, I'm trying to always think, does it have to be real time? Does it actually have to be real time, or can it be near real time? Are they gonna save the record and go on to something else? It doesn't matter that as soon as they save and come back to the account page, it doesn't already look like whatever they need to have done. Can they wait and try to move it off if we can? So that is my spiel on asynchronous. So the main ways of running Apex asynchronously, one of them, and the first one that sort of came to be, was a future method. So you can have a method that you could, in the past, could have run, let's say, synchronously. You call it from a trigger handler, whatever. If you decide, oh, I want to make that run in a queue, very easy to implement. You just put @future as an annotation, and I'll show you what that looks like. With the only difference is that you aren't allowed to pass like a list of leads, let's say, into the method, or a list of, or a map of accounts or anything. You have to only pass what they call primitives, which are IDs, strings. That's kind of all you would practically, you can integers, but that's, I can't imagine why you would send integers in. But anyhow, so you're only allowed to send a future method a list or a set of primitive values. So that's the one downside. But in it, you would use it to easily be able to implement a call out. Or sometimes you might see mixed DML errors. So that's where you have a non-setup object and a setup object, both being inserted or updated in the same transaction. So let's say you've got some automation that, I don't know, creates a public group and then creates public group members and then also does something with accounts and contacts. Can't do that. That gets mixed. So you can take part of it and put it into a future method. And so then that happens, you know, let's say all the setup object record creation happens asynchronously in a future method. So that's another reason you might use it. And then more recently, I can't remember how many years back now, but they came out with this queueable, which is like future method, but then way more. So with Queueable Apex, it's a little more complicated to set up because instead of just at future annotation, you actually have to have your own class, which implements the Queueable interface. And I'll show you an example. So it's a little more setup. But you're allowed to send it now lists of S objects. So it's a lot more flexible. Another awesome thing is you can chain jobs together. So you can have one queueable run. At the end of the queueable, you can call another queueable. Or within that queueable, whatever's happening, let's say my queueable code, I want to, I don't know, create a case for every new account where, I don't know, the rating is hot or something random. When that Queueable Apex that's creating the case runs, if it in turn has some kind of Queueable Apex that also is triggered because of the case trigger, let's say, it's allowed to then spawn one other queueable job. Whereas with future, you can't. If you are running a future, if you call a future method and now you're in the future context, you're not allowed to call yet another future, and you'll get an error if you do. So it gives you a little more flexibility there. What else? Yeah, that's kind of it for that one. And then scheduled Apex is where you can you implement the schedulable interface, and then you can actually schedule jobs to run. So you can go in either through the front end in Salesforce to schedule. I think you go to the list of Apex classes and you click schedule, and it shows you all the ones, or you can pick one that is schedulable, if that's a real word. Or you can do it through the back end using some cron expressions, which I'll show you. So this one's great because you can, like I said, once you schedule it to run, let's say once a day or whatever, then that code will just run on that schedule. You don't have to remember to click a button or do anything. And the nice thing is you can schedule a batch job. So you can, and we'll talk about batch next, but you can actually schedule the batch to run, and then the batch will do what it needs to do in the batches and chunks of data. So then batch Apex is the next one. That's where you will need to use it if you want to process a large volume of data. If you have thousands of records, tens of thousands of records that need to be run through, processed, tagged, cleaned, whatever it is, you're going to hit some limits there in terms of how many records you can query for, how many DML inserts you can, or updates you can do. So if you put it into batch Apex, then you can tell the system the size of the batch, or it defaults to 200, and it will go through all the code. You send it the big query. It goes through all of that, the records in chunks of 200, and does the processing. And then at the end, there's this finish method that you can do something or nothing, doesn't matter. But that's another way that it will just run on its own. And it allows you now to, you know, if the transaction to do this update of whatever data is so big that it's hitting limits of other sorts, then you can batch it up in small batches. I even have a client that has batch of one. They want to convert leads every night that are X number of days old, that haven't been whatever. They take it and they convert it, and they do it in batches of one. But yeah, so that's worth one. See, somebody has put a chat in. Let me just see. Oh, that's thank you. Okay. Okay, so that's my high level. I'm going to start going into detail of each one and then show you some code examples. Before I jump into features, is there anyone that has questions at this point?
I just want to say, yeah, I'm really excited about this. You just mentioned someone doing a batch job for a limit of 1 to convert leads. And like I think that's a big one, at least. I don't know if it's a big one for everyone, but my company is having that issue with converting leads like automatically. So I think that's a really, you know, it's good to know like that kind, you know, what the options are, you know?
Yeah, I have another actually same client who they process leads, and they use the matching rules and duplicate rules to see if there's already a contact or an account out there. And duplicate rules are limited to the find duplicates. It's only 50 records at a time. So that's where we use batch, and we limit it. You can limit it to 50. And in fact, with that one, we also go to 1 because this is just a side note on the duplicate matching, but when you do find duplicates, it looks for those 50 records in the database, but doesn't look between those 50 records. So you could have 3 of the same leads, for example, that none of they're all the same. They're all Niki, and there doesn't happen to be an account out there for Niki. And so when we do our duplicate match, we say, no, there's nothing for Niki. Then we go ahead and just create 3 Nikis, because within the set it doesn't. So anyway, they go to 1. But yeah, that's another. So if you we'll go through the batch, but if you don't say what your size is, it defaults to 200. But if you want to make it lower, you can do that by specifying what size you want for your batch. So yeah. All right. And so if more people have questions, just jump in. I'm just going to keep going because I can't see everybody's waving their hands or whatnot. Okay, so future, let's start with that. We talked a lot about all this stuff already, but so adding the future annotation on the method, that's all you need to do. You do have to make sure if it's used to take in sets of leads or lists of whatever, that you now, typically what you see as a pattern, people take a set of IDs that come in, and then they just query in, this is the beginning of the method, is query for the whatever data I need about that lead or that record, and then start working on whatever it is I'm doing. But you can only send in lists or sets of IDs and strings and whatnot. You can't send back a return. Kind of makes sense because nobody's watching. It's happening and off it goes. So it's a void versus being able to return a list of the leads that you just processed, for example. You are limited to 50 future calls being triggered in one transaction. So if I had a case, I create a case, and I have some kind of loop or some kind of something, and I'm all of a sudden, I'm triggering, calling more than 50 times a future call to go and do something, it's going to give me a failure. You can only call within a transaction, within a synchronous transaction, you can only create 50 future calls. So you have to be careful. For example, if you're in a trigger and inside a loop, you're calling a future method. Nah, don't do that. Same as any kind of loop stuff, because if you had more than 50 records in that loop that need this call to be made, now you're going to hit your limit. So you have to be a little bit careful with it, make sure it's not in loops. And also, I noticed that some clients, if you have a lot of asynchronous Apex, so lots of future calls, lots of queuables, lots of things being queued up, somehow Salesforce is like, ooh, that client, that org is doing too many asynchronous things. I'm gonna put them down to the bottom. They don't get top first choice, first queue up. So you actually can, if you create too many of these, you can actually be delayed. They kind of put you down to the bottom because you're too noisy. So you have to be a little careful with that. And that's the thing with these, is also you can't guarantee when they're going to be processed or even the order in which they're processed. It truly is just queuable, put into the queue, and there is actually a way that you can look at that order of queuable, but that's not for today's discussion. But anyway, so you can't really rely on the order of it. I talked about that you can't trigger a future in a future. So if you're in future context, then you can't trigger it. I was looking at the Trailhead and I noticed it's a little out of date. The Trailhead for future Apex, it talks about this, like you have to be careful that you don't trigger a future, but then it goes off to this older blog post about ways that you can figure out if you're in a future method. Well, they've created this very simple system method called isFuture. So you put that in your code and you say, if system is future equals true, then you know that you are you're in a method in a future context. So you might, sometimes I see code where it's about to call a future method, but to protect itself, it's like, hey, are you for future right now? Then don't call that. If you're not future, then call that. Of course, you have to figure out what to do if you're in future, but you still need to do that thing. But anyway, so this method system.isFuture is available to be able to tell if you're in the future context. So let's look at code, because that's more interesting.
One question I have.
Yeah.
So you said like we can call a future method from a trigger. So when we do that, I mean, like if we want the response to be like we want to do something on the response that we get after calling a future method. So what should we do?
Well, you're not going to get a response from calling the future method. You call it and that's done. There's nothing else. It will run. So if you need to do something because of what you've done in the future method, you put that in the future method. Or for example, if the future method is, go and create a contact or something, then that contact will get generated. And then all of the triggers and the workflows and the process builder and the flows that normally run when you create a contact, those will happen. So if you had some automation based on the data you're creating or updating in the future method, that will happen when that future method actually runs.
Okay.
But you
Okay.
won't be able to real time get back, oh, did you create those contacts? Great, now do something else, because the whole point is it's asynchronous, so it's running in a separate transaction that you have no visibility into or control over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Yeah.
Okay. So future, I've got some code in here around callouts. So my example is this company wants to be able to get every day, they want to get what the exchange rate is for US to Canada, because they want to be able to use it in opportunities or whatever else that they have. This is their thing. And they've got this xe.com is a website that has lots of stuff about currency, and I signed up for this currency data API. So I've got the username, I've got a password. So you can see in here, I'm building an HTTP callout where I'm saying, go to this endpoint, go get me the US to CAD conversion rate. Here's my authentication. I've got this exchange rate custom object where I want to put my exchange rate for the day. So I have this future method. So here you can see I've got that at future annotation. And now because this example is doing a callout, you have to include callout equals to true to tell the method it's okay to do callouts from this one. You have to add that in. If you're not doing callouts, you can just leave that out completely. It doesn't need to be there. So what I'm doing in this code is I'm going to get the rate, which is the HTTP callout I just talked about. And then if I don't get anything, I'm going to create an exception. So I'll talk about this in more detail at the end, but you want to think about what are you going to do if there's a problem. Normally, if you hit save on an opportunity and the code bombs out, you at least get like the ugly red at the top saying, ah, there's been an unexpected Apex, whatever, right? Or maybe your developer's been nice and said, oh, there's been a problem, please contact so-and-so. But the person knows there's an issue and everything stops and they didn't get to save their change. But now we're asynchronous, so nobody's watching, nobody's looking at the debug log to see if there's any errors, and nobody knows, unless they run the report waiting for that data that's not there, nobody knows that it didn't happen. So you got to think about what to do in those situations. You don't want to, I mean, if you don't handle the exception, that's fine, it will just go into the log that nobody cares about, but you want to think, should I be emailing somebody? Maybe I should send an email with the error message. What I usually do for my clients, I have a package I created, which is basically just an object that logs exceptions from asynchronous calls. So I have a method called generate exception. I pass it some like title basically and detail, and it creates a record in an object. Then you can do whatever. You can do email alerts. You can do reports. You can subscribe to reports that says, you know, is anything new today? You can report on it. You can do whatever you want on it. You can mark it as fixed when you've finished it. You can whatever. So that's usually what I do. And so you can see here I have two. I say, well, go get the rate. And if nothing came back, it's because something happened down here. So I'm going to say, hey, I couldn't even set it something. I didn't get my rate back. If I did get my rate back, then I'm going to take it and put it into my new exchange rate record with today's date and time so I can track it. And then I insert that exchange rate record. And if somewhere in all this stuff, probably the insert, something bombs, I'm going to catch that and I'm going to give myself another, or in this case, an exception that says, hey, I tried to execute it. And, you know, I usually give myself the stack trace string because that gives you more info, like what line of code it was, from what class, blah, blah, and then the exception message. So now I can send myself an email or whatever I'm doing, I'm logging that. So this is happening asynchronously.
Sorry, Niki, I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry, on the authentication.
Yes.
It's got the basic token value in there.
Yeah.
You don't normally do that, do you? That's
No.
just a demo.
I wouldn't say you would do that. You would put it somewhere like a backend setting, or you could use a named credential. I was doing this last night at 10 o'clock, so I just threw it in. But yeah, you wouldn't probably put it in your code. Although, I mean, unless you have Salesforce login, you're gonna be able to see that, but still I wouldn't, because it's just base 64 encrypting. So I think you can decrypt it and then you can see my account ID and my API key. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so what we wanted to do with this customer was they want to have an exchange rate created every day. So here I get to show two things at once. So I have a scheduled Apex. Let me make that bigger. So this is, and we'll talk more about how you implement the schedule, but basically I'm scheduling a job, or I'm creating a job that could be scheduled, and here it is calling what I just looked at, set today's rate. So if I want to run this myself, I can do it in Anonymous Apex. Let me first go into, see if we can find our exchange rates. I don't know where I would have put that. I think here. Here we go. So here's my tab for my awesome exchange rates. And you can see I ran this yesterday, and I got a certain exchange rate from yesterday. So if I want to get today's exchange rate, I'll go into my IDE. I think VS Code has the same thing. Go to Anonymous Apex. Oh, and there we go. I can just call directly. So we go back to this. This is a static method, which means, and all future methods have to be static, which means I don't have to instantiate the class. I can just call it directly. I can just take class name dot method name. In this case, I don't pass it anything because I just want it to run and get today's rate. There's nothing dynamic about what I want it to do other than that. So I'm just calling it directly. So I'm going to run that. And if you look at the log, it's pretty short, right? In this log, oh, I should have opened the developer console. In this log, I'm not doing anything other than calling my Apex, triggering the feature. That's all I'm doing. So there's nothing to see. In the actual, if I look at the next transaction, we would actually see what all this code is doing. And I forgot to open that up. So I can, you guys care? I can either just keep going or I can do it again. It's up to you. If I see anyone saying, dude, I want to see, then I'll do it. Okay, so here's today. So today the rates changed slightly. It's still terrible, Canadian dollar. But anyway, so this is today. So it went ahead, it called out, created this record for me, and it did that in an asynchronous transaction. It didn't do it for me right when I was waiting. I'll just for fun get my dev console open and do that one more time. So I'm going to delete this one. And okay, so here we are. And come back here and run this again. Should see, okay, so the one that says API, that's me running it through my IDE using the API. So if I open that up, you'll see the same thing where it's just like nothing happened. But you can see here a number of feature calls, 1 out of 50. So I used one of them. And then here you can see in the log, it's a feature handler. So this is actually that feature method that I just called is now running in its own transaction. So if I open that one, now I can actually see the code saying, okay, here's my HTTP request, my call out, yep, got that value back, great. Here I am inserting my exchange rate record and any workflows or whatever I have, which I don't, in here. And you can see number of feature calls, none. I didn't run any feature calls here. I am in feature context, but I didn't actually trigger any. So this is the second separate one. And if you were to look in the back end, you can also see it run if you look at Apex jobs. So in here, which I'll come back to for everything, you can see the fact that I just ran a feature call. And you can actually see what class it is and what method I ran. And so you can see here I ran it twice. This is kind of confusing. It says how many batches and whatever. That's only valid if it's batch Apex that's running. So don't be afraid that, why is it saying 0? It's just because it's not relevant to future, or this is my example from yesterday of my Queueable. So this is the job ID. It runs, it does whatever it does. And you can see it back here showing as future. So now if I came back here and refreshed, you would see my new rate. Yeah, so that's kind of it. I mean, there's lots you can do with it. It doesn't have to be a call out. I have other ones where I do pass in sets of IDs and I do some querying and I do whatever, but the basics are you have to have at future, has to be static void. You can't pass back anything. You can't do a return. And if you do send it something, it has to be primitive. It can't be SObjects. Okay, so then let's look at Queueable. So similar, you just want to do something in a separate transaction. This one is a little more, like I said, there's a little more setup. You have to create your own class. You can use a constructor to do some pre-work if you want, and then you have an execute. And the way to call it, rather than like I did in the Apex Anonymous, just call the method, you would actually use what's called system.enqueueJob, and then you pass it an object of this class that you want it to run. Same idea, you can only enqueue up to 50 in your synchronous transaction. So again, you don't want to put this in a loop just because it's queuable doesn't mean you can loop it. And only one queuable can be enqueued when you're in a queuable. And same idea, there's this test or system.isQueuable, so you know whether you're in the queuable context. You can use that in your code. You can chain them together, which is a cool feature. So when you have a bunch of different things you want to do, you can have at the end of one, you can enqueue the next one. But the one thing with that is you're not allowed to do that if you're running a test. So I know I don't like to suggest putting test type stuff in production code, but if you are doing a chain, when you go to call the second one, you have to say if test is running, test is false. Otherwise, you have to make the test skip that, otherwise the test will fail. So kind of a weird thing, but, and there's actually no limit to how many chains you can do. I don't know, you wouldn't want a limitless one, but anyway, you don't have a limit on that. The limit is, you have to be careful with this. I do have some clients where I've been using the queuable a lot, and then all of a sudden I realize, ah, shoot, I've got one queuable that does something, like creates a license record or something, and then it spawned 2 other things that were also queuable. Boom, right away. So you have to kind of keep track of your chain of methods. Otherwise you start to say, if you overuse it in one transaction, you have to check, don't run this unless I'm not in the queuable or in the future context. Okay, so an example. So one of my customers wanted to track their lead status on the campaign members. I don't know if anyone has worked with campaigns and campaign members, so sorry for your luck. But anyway, you can't pull fields out of the leads and the contacts through a campaign member other than like first name, last name, phone, and title, and company name or something, a few standard fields. And what they wanted to do is run reports on campaigns. How many leads do I have in a certain status? And roll it up and get a number to roll up. So what we did is created a custom field on the campaign member for lead status. And then every time a lead status is changed, we want to go back and find all the campaign members for that lead and update the status so that it reflects the latest status. And that's something we don't need the user to wait for. They can, someone can update the lead status and then go on with their business. They don't really care whether campaign members are updated or not. They don't want to wait for that. So this is a great candidate for doing something asynchronously, so we're not making people wait. And if there happened to be some kind of error with the campaign and the campaign member, the salesperson's like, I don't care, I just want to change the status of my lead. So now if that error happens, again, it'll be tracked in the exception tracker and someone else can deal with that. And they can get about their business. So here you're going to see the class has to be, I usually put QEUE at the end or somewhere in there just as a naming convention. So if I'm looking at a list, I can easily find it. But you want to implement this queuable interface, which really all that means is just put the word implements and queuable up there and you're good. You can use a constructor, which is, if those in your RAD class remember, you just have public and then the name is the same as the class name with no return value. That makes it a constructor. So when someone creates a new object of this class, this is what runs. So basically I'm taking in a list of leads. This is where we talked about you can send it S objects. So I have a list of leads that have come in. These are all the leads presumably from the trigger that just said, oh, my status changed. I better go talk to the campaign member code. And so we store that in a variable within the class so that when we get to the execution, we still have track of it. Otherwise, if we don't store it outside of my constructor, once you get to this method, it won't know about it. So you store it up here, and then we get to this execute. So this is part of the queuable class. You always have to include this method execute, which takes the queuable context. Again, you don't have to worry about the details too much. You basically, generally what I do is have this constructor which passes in, what do you want me to work on? And then the execute is, what am I doing with those records? So here I'm simply doing a query for campaign members for all the leads I passed in. I want to get the lead status, what I have already, and what is the leads status right now. And then I go through them and I say, okay, are they different? Like if they're the same, I don't need to make updates. If they're different, update them and put it in the list and then do an update. And then if I had any errors through all of that, I'm going to put it into an exception tracker here with some issues. And what I added here was, I'm going to actually include the list of leads because those are the leads that are going to need to be reprocessed later by somebody, some lucky person that looks at these errors. So that's the structure of the queuable. And then to call it from my synchronous, I've got a lead trigger that is after you update a lead with this new status. Here's my helper. I'm going to call this method I created called update campaign member. Oh, I'll make it bigger for you guys, sorry. Update campaign member. So I'm going to pass in my list of my leads. And so here I'm just coming in and saying, hey, did your status just change? And if so, put it in a list. And then I put this in for us to play with. I'm basically using a custom label that says, hey, if you want me to do this queuably, say yes. And if so, I'm going to enqueue my job. If you don't want me to, then I'm going to do it synchronously. So, and then I just added the same, just as you probably wouldn't rewrite your code again, but just to be quick, we can try it synchronously and we can try it asynchronously by changing the label. Okay, so this is how we're calling it. So here
Sorry,
you can,
another question. Sorry. Now, just on your exceptions, are you just logging that to the debug log, or are you going to put that in a object, or what do you do?
I'll show you. I would.
Okay.
I don't have to wait to the end. So this is a class. This is a little package I use for my clients where it's very simple. It's an object and it's some methods you can use. So basically, when you call this generate exception, it's simply you pass in a method name. I mean, you call this whatever you want. You pass in two strings. One is the title, the short thing, and one's the long thing. And then I basically, sorry, I go in and I create a new record. And the title is whatever you passed in. The details are whatever else you passed in. I trim it off to 100,000 characters if you passed in some super huge thing. And then I insert it. So it looks, I don't know if I created myself a tab here. Let's see if I can find it. But it's essentially an object. Yeah, I didn't create a tab for it in this org. But there would be a tab that has exception trackers and a list of them. You can create, a process builder or workflow to send. I usually do that to send an email that a new exception was generated with all the detail that I passed it. So yeah, I'm actually tracking it in an object in that Salesforce org where it happened. So let's go to leads. I have one that Bertha Boxer, that I set up with a whole bunch of campaigns. I tried to make it actually show a difference, but unfortunately I didn't. I mean, I could add, I guess, 1,000 campaigns that might make a difference, but I've got about 100 campaigns in here, I think, that this person they've gone to a lot of conferences apparently. And if you go to the list, you can see the lead status right now on each of the campaign members. This is a list of campaign members, is open, not contacted. So if I go into my custom label, let's see what I've got for label. Here's my label. So right now it says yes. So if we remember, the code said if trigger queuable says yes, then do it in a queuable. So that's what's going to happen. And I've got my console open. Okay, so if I go in here and change the lead status to working, and I hit save, it goes super fast. See, it's so fast. This was queuable. It was in a different transaction, but it happened quickly. And Lightning is not as fast as we wish it would be. So by the time it finished resolving itself, it's already got the new values, right? Working contacted. It's not as great a show, but I can still show you in the background. So here we have Aura, which is the synchronous change in Salesforce that I made of the Lightning platform. Sadly, it used to be so much more informative, like what account ID or opportunity ID you were, but anyway. So here you can see I've run my lead. Here's my trigger. It doesn't usually, I guess I don't have any debug in there saying I've just called a queuable. So that's the synchronous. This is what happened. I changed the status. My lead trigger did run. I didn't put any debug log to say I'm about to call a queuable, so nothing really happened in there. And then you can see the queuable handler here. So now you have the second transaction. Similar, the other one said future handler. This one nicely says it's a queuable handler. So in here is the actual logic. I'm going to query how many campaign members do I have for all the leads that were passed in. I've got 103. I'm now going to do an update of 103 records, and is there any flows for campaign members, blah, blah, and then I'm done. So this is the actual queuable part of it. And then if I won't waste time on this, but if I change this to no, then you'd see the same thing. It might take slightly longer for the thing to save, but then it would actually do all those changes synchronously. I'd have to wait for it. And if there was some issue with the insert and I hadn't captured it, then I would get a big red, I had a problem. in here, and the person wouldn't be able to continue. So anyway, that's my queuable. Any questions on the queuable and or the difference between feature and queuable?
Can you, you kind of went quickly over the trigger that calls the queuable class, and that's something I haven't been able to find very often, examples of that.
Yeah, so I use a pretty straightforward trigger pattern where basically in the trigger, I have whatever events I might want to be watching for. So in this case, I just picked, before and after both insert and update. I don't actually, in this dev org, I don't really care about the insert or the before, but you could. And so what I do is a pattern where I say, if the trigger is after and it's update, then go to my trigger helper class, which is over here, and call the after update event. And I could also continue with like, else if the trigger is after insert, then call the after insert event, which I don't have. But if I could. And then of course, if it's insert, I don't have an old map, so don't pass that because that's going to be an issue. Or if you pass it, it's going to be null. So, but yeah, I just keep going if, else, if, else, if. To be honest, I usually put it like my brain is sort of linear. So I would say like before insert, after insert, before update, after update, in a row like that. It doesn't really matter. So then that's the pattern in the trigger side. The benefit now is if I want to do more stuff after update, I don't have to go into my trigger and do anything. I just go to my handler and add more stuff in that. So then my pattern that I use over here is I have a method that is my after update in this case. And from there, I don't do stuff in there. That's like sort of my manager one where I then call a list of methods. Whatever I want to do after update, I'm going to call those methods. So here I have this one called update campaign member lead status, and I pass what I got in here. I pass that to this method, and then I do whatever work I need to do in there. That way, if I had more things I wanted to do, the developer who's doing those new things don't have to mess around with what I'm doing. They just add a new, whatever my next logic is, and I do it there. Or if they say, ooh, what I'm doing is so important because it might, I don't know, change the lead status. Well, I want to run that before I do this call because this call is, well, this is after update. But anyways, you can sort of order what you're doing, but not mix the code together. So that's how I usually do it. Yeah. There's lots of ways to build these kind of, this is not the only way, but I find this is low enough overhead. I don't mind setting this up. There's some patterns that are really robust, but I find for most of my clients, it's kind of too much, so.
Very cool,
yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Niki, I have a question. So can you give us the real-time scenario for chaining the queuable jobs? Because I haven't, seen such a real-time example, like how do they use it? So
yeah, I was trying to think of it. I know I have a client who chains batch jobs together, and I can show you that. I'm trying to think who would chain queuables.
I have an example if you want one.
Oh yeah, awesome, Melissa.
I have a few of these, and a lot of times I'm doing it when I'm making like a series of call outs. So like a lot of times if you're calling out to an external service, sometimes they'll return you like paginated responses. And so you don't know how many times you're going to have to keep calling out to get all the responses. And you can only make 100 call outs or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So I basically keep track of how many I've done. And if I get to the limit, I stop and then queue up the next job with, whatever information it needs to keep going.
Cool. So you do that in a loop of some sort? You get the response and then you loop through it and do it that way?
Yeah, exactly. I'm looping through and I'm keeping track of how many I have left and how many I've made. And then when I get to what I know is the limit, I just stop and then queue up the next one.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great pattern. Yeah, because you can use, there's so much I could show you in Apex, but you can use, there's a limits class where you can say, what is my limit for queuables or whatever, or callouts, and how many have I done? So then you can compare them. If I'm less than my limit, keep going. If not, then yeah, do another queuable that's going to do another one that's managing all of the jobs. So yeah, cool. That's a great example. Scheduled Apex is the next one. So this one also requires a separate class that you can, with a constructor, it's optional if you want, and an execute. So you're going to implement the schedulable interface. And here to trigger it, you can use what's called system.schedule, and then you pass in the class that you want to schedule, and a cron expression, which I'll show you, which is, you know, how many times a day, or what days of the week, or what time, when do you want it to run, and then a name for the job, and then it will schedule that for you. And there's a limit of only 100 jobs that can be scheduled at any one time for your company. So you have to be a little bit careful with how many you're going to schedule. You cannot do call outs from a scheduled Apex. So a lot of times you'll see, which I think I showed you briefly with the exchange rate, you schedule Apex and then you make an asynchronous call. Like, so you call a feature method or you call a Queueable from inside your scheduled Apex. And the actual scheduled Apex itself does nothing other than call that thing. That's a way to get around that. So I use this quite often for, well, I mentioned that one client who every night they want to convert their leads that have been sitting there for a week or whatever the criteria. So we schedule the job to run at 2 in the morning, and the job will start and it will query, you know, how many leads do I have that need to be converted, and then it actually uses batch. So a lot of times you see these two mixed together, scheduled and batch. You schedule the cleanup job, and the job itself is in batch so that it doesn't hit limits of how many records can I process, whatever it is I'm doing. Yeah, so you can, and then you can see the jobs that are scheduled and what the schedule, or what you can see what the next scheduled runtime is in the backend. So I'll show you what that looks like. So this one, I have a customer that uses the declarative rollup summary. I don't know if anyone has ever used that. It's an awesome free product to do rollups on a lookup. And also rollups you're not allowed to do with, even if it's master detail based on whatever the formulas and the things that they are nasty about. So let me just pull that up here. I just have it. Okay. So this one is, so this one's pretty simple. Oh, that's because I closed all the code. So there's a lot of calculations I need. So essentially what this scenario is, they've got records that have available credit, and the credit expires at a certain time. And so we want to roll up how much credit do I have available to the account. But on the night that it expires, nothing's really like modifying the child record that has the credit to then force the DLRS to run again. Because you need actually a child record to be modified to then trigger the parent recalculation. So it works real time when I add my record and I say, yeah, I've got $100,000 credit available until Friday. It'll do that count for you. But until that record is actually modified again, it won't know that it went from Friday to Saturday morning to know to recalculate. So in this scenario, you have to do your own nightly recalculation of anything that has credit. Go and recalculate, say, do I still have credit? And update it if I don't, or if it's changed at all. So that's all this, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to bore you with. So that's all this code. It's doing a count and a calculation and yada, yada. It's not that important. But what I have done here is I've implemented the schedulable interface. I've given my, in this case, I don't have a constructor. There's nothing I need to do ahead of time. I'm not passing it anything. I could if I wanted, but I'm not. This is what you need, is an execute method. And in my execute method, I'm just calling the method that's actually doing the thing. And I often do that so I can test this method without having to actually execute a schedule. If I just want to test, like write unit tests for what's in here, I pull it outside of the execute. And then I just call it as another method. And that helps too if you've got code in a utility class or all over the place, you can call it from inside of the schedulable class. And then what I've done for a lot of clients that don't understand cron, or maybe often will cancel and then want to reschedule the job, I've just created a public method called schedule. And they said, I want to do this at 3 in the morning every day. So I said, great, I'm going to create, this is the cron expression. So there's a link in the resources where it talks about how to build your cron expression. You're a lot more flexible with doing it through scheduling it through the system schedule method than you are if you just go to the Salesforce interface and say, I want to schedule. You can only pick like once a week or once a day, give it a time. This allows you to be way more flexible. You can do every 2 hours or whatever with your cron. So it's worth kind of understanding. But anyhow, I'm gonna call this to, so anyone can go to execute anonymous and go, you know, account CDP schedule, go. And that will schedule this job for 3 a.m. every day of the week all the time. And it's going to be called nightly account CDP, this is the job. So the way you do it is you say system.schedule, you give it a name, you give it the cron expression, which I've done up there, and then you give it an instantiation of whatever, of this method. So it's a bit confusing because it's inside the method and you're calling itself, but the point is you would say, I want a new instantiation, a new object for this class. I don't have anything to pass it because it doesn't require any input, and go and schedule it. So the way that, I'll show you, I can't get too into this because this is actually one of my clients' orgs, but you would just, like I said, you would go into the execute anonymous, type that dot schedule and semicolon, and then run. And then you will see it in the back end in the scheduling. And then when it actually is scheduled to run, it will do whatever is inside the execute. So in this case, it's going to calculate available credit. And so inside there is where I'm doing all my stuff. I'm doing try catch because I'm a good girl. And then I'm putting my exception into this. If I have any errors, I'm rolling back all the stuff that I've done because I've got multiple things in here. And then I'm passing this exception into my tracker. So yeah, so that's schedulable. And I think I also showed you a brief example here of a very simple schedulable without that fancy way of scheduling it for yourself, where you can schedule it and it will just run this method, and that's in a different class altogether. So that's a really easy way to take code that you've already got running somewhere else and say, hey, I want to start doing that every day or every hour or every whatever, and you can just whip this up. So again, the points for schedulable is you have to implement that schedulable interface, and you need to have an execute method with this schedulable context, which you don't even really use inside here. It's just a way to get into the execute. Let's go on to the last one, which is batch. So batch is more of a special case that you would want to do it when you have a lot of data. You don't want to do a batch if you only have 5 records. I mean, basically anything less than 200, don't bother setting up a batch. But if it could be large data, it could be lots, that's when you want to do it. So again, you need a separate, well, this is actually not quite true. You can do it inside of a schedule, but you basically need a separate class for that implements the batchable, or a class that does that. Again, you have the option to do a constructor to set yourself up. Then you have a start, an execute, and a finish. So start runs once, execute runs over and over and over for each batch until we're done, and then finish runs once. So that's how those methods go together. And you don't have to do anything in finish, but sometimes people are so excited, they put in an email to someone saying, hey, we're done the batch, we ran this many batches and this long or whatever, but you don't have to. So this case, to get a batch going, you would use database.execute batch. So all of these ones have slightly different, you've got your system and queue, you've got your, all these different ways, system schedule. This one's database execute batch. And then you pass in the class, and you can optionally pass, or you can pass in an optional batch size. If you don't do that, then fine, it just uses 200. But if you want to do a different size batch, you can pass it in. You can't go higher than 200, I'm pretty sure. There is a way that you can add this item called stateful, where you can have the batch, basically it sort of remembers, it keeps a state of what's going on through all the executions of your batches. And you can track values, like maybe you wanted to have, I don't know, like a total opportunity of all time. And so as you're going through batches of opportunities, you're adding to that total amount in each batch. And then at the finish, you now have a total of all your batches. So there are reasons why you would want to do that, but it does slow things down because it's got to keep track of all these things. So if you don't need it, I wouldn't put it in. It slows your batch jobs down. When you're testing batch Apex, you have to be careful. You only ever feed it whatever numbers of records would cause one batch to run. So if you limit your batch, if you're calling and saying, I'm doing a batch of 50, don't pass it 100 records. In production that works, it does 2 batches, but in test it doesn't, it fails because it's only able to do 1 batch. So when you test it, you have to be a little bit careful that you don't go over your batch size. And then also batches can chain things together. So you've got your execute, you've got your start and your finish. So I have an example of this with one client who has, they bring in like lead data, asset data into these staging objects. They want to process leads. They want to process these assets linked to the leads. They clean up after themselves. They delete leads that didn't get assets, blah, blah, all this stuff. And there's like 6 batch classes that all just call in one after the other. So when the first one's finished, send all its leads, it then executes the next one. That one finishes all the assets, it then executes the next one. And they just keep going like that. So that's another one where you can sort of chain them together. What else? I think that's all I wanted to say about that. So I have a couple of examples of these ones. Territory. Okay, so this one is another different client now who they have leads and accounts that are using a custom territory module. So they wanted to do it by zip code or postal code and country. And there was like, I don't know, like 1 million postal codes or something crazy. And so we're not going to use assignment rules, I'm sorry. And also you can't use assignment rules on accounts. And so we end up building a custom object that has territories, a child that holds the state or the country or zip code, depending how far down you want to go. And we want to run all the leads and all the accounts through this. So if they want to do a mass realignment, they would go into their territories, move zip codes around, get it all sorted, and now they want to process all their leads and all their accounts to get them into the right territory. So we definitely we have to do that in batch. They have like 200,000 leads and I don't know how many accounts. So this, I call this from I've got a Visualforce page I created them a few years back, where basically they have a screen that says you have this many leads and this many accounts, are you ready to go? And they can click a button. And the button that they click executes this. So it's going to start this batch job. And it's going to send them, you have the option. I think I actually, yeah, here's the I won't go through all of it because it's kind of complicated, but the button that they click to start the lead realignment, they have two options. They could be doing it from one territory. They might just have like US West. They just wanted to clean it up and they don't want to realign the entire database. They just want to go through any lead that's in US West. And are you still supposed to be here? If not, go where you're supposed to go. Otherwise, stay where you are. Or I might want to do them for all. So I have a query that I'm sending into the batch. So here you can see I'm doing a string where I'm saying get the company and all the address stuff I need from the leads where they're not converted and they're not deleted. Where in this case, I want a certain territory ID. Whereas in this case, I'm doing all territories. Both of them you can see are calling the database execute batch. They're both doing a new realigned territory batch and they're passing in their respective query. So when I go to the realign territory batch, I'm expecting you, if you're calling me, you're going to pass me the query. Like, what do you want me to do here? Which records do you want me to manage? So here I have my class that implements the database batchable. So that's how I'm in here. I've got my constructor. In this case, I am using a constructor because I want you to first, before you start, pass me the query of that I'm supposed to run. And then all my start method does is I go and run the query. I've got the string of the query. Hopefully you didn't do any typos. And I'm just going to run that query. When you called me from back here, you didn't give me a batch size. You could have done this. You could have said, do it in 100. That would be valid. Batch, see, it even says batch size 100. Sorry, I keep forgetting to make this bigger. So you could have called me with the batch size, but in this case you didn't. So I'm just going to use 200. So all you're doing in the start is doing the query. The execute is the thing that does all the work. So the execute is running. It's now going to say, okay, go query my assignment rules and blah, blah, all this stuff that's happening. I definitely make sure that I have exception trackers on my batch because I could be running this 20, 30 times. If one of these batches has an error, I want to keep track of it. So I'm putting that each batch when it finishes, if it had issues, it puts them in. And this one, I don't know if you've seen this pattern with partial save. Again, I don't want to get sidetracked, but you can do an update where you can say all or nothing is false. So let's say I have 100 records. If 2 of them have errors, I want the other 98 to go because I don't want to have to clean up all 100 just because 2 of them have errors. So I'm doing a partial update and then I'm cycling through my save results to say, did this one save? Did this one save? Did this one save? If any of them didn't save, I'm keeping a little blurb about that particular, in this case, lead that had problems, adding it to a set of errors. And only if I have errors do I then send to the exception tracker just those errors. Because now we know that the other 98 records still pass, they still saved. So I use that to sort of allow myself to use validation rules or whatever, stop things. It doesn't help the whole thing. And then in this case, I don't do anything for my finish. You still have to put it in, but there's nothing there. Just, and we sort of talked about this, but things to think about that when you're in your synchronous call, you can trigger 50 futures or 50 queuables, but when you're in the future or the queuable, you have a limit. So future, you can't do any. And queuables, you can only do one. So you have to be a little bit careful as you're starting to go crazy with queuables that you don't start trying to trigger one from the other. And then then note that you can from your finish method. Oh, I don't think queuables have finish method. I got confused with batch. With your finish method of batch, you can call the next one. With a queuable, you just have one execute. So at the end of there, you can call another one. So we talked about that already. So here's just a couple of resources that might be of interest. There's a module about Asynchronous Apex. I think if you've done RAD, you've probably had to go through them already. But it's a nice little learning module for each one of the 4 things I talked about. And there's also, if you want to get super geeky, you can get into the dev guide. Gives you a lot more detail about each of the 4. And then I also put a link in here for some feedback on how to create these cron expressions. Even if you're not writing your own, you have, like, let's say you have an install package where they have a job that you want to have scheduled more than once a day, but you don't want to create 2 scheduled jobs, one for 10 and one for whatever. You should check this out, because you can schedule Apex through Execute Anonymous and give it your own schedule. That's not possible with the interface in Salesforce. You can say, like, I've got a client that every 2 hours on the even hour code runs. And you do that with a cron expression as something like 0/2 or something in the hour. This is just not possible in the front end of Salesforce. So it's definitely, even if you're not coding, it's a cool thing to know about.
Niki, so what type of issues do you face when we do this when we use any of these asynchronous?
Well, yeah, good question. I mean, one of the main things is, how do I track my errors and how do I do it again? That's one of the tricks, is like with this poor client who has to wait so long to win a deal. Some of it, they don't really need to wait for the renewal opportunity and the license and the so-and-so, but if it fails, you need to provide a way for the user to re-execute that thing, that string of stuff you wanted. You can't rely on them having to, okay, well, sorry, but you're gonna have to make your opportunity open again and then try closing it again. Like, we don't wanna do that. So that can be a challenge, is to give them a button or an interface or a way to, first of all, figure out, like, someone has to be watching that log and caring about that as one thing, but also giving them a way to redo it once whatever the underlying issue has been resolved. How can they re-execute it? That sometimes can be tricky. Yeah, and I mean, as a consultant, I usually keep myself on these, like my own email on these workflow alerts, because oftentimes they don't either care, they don't look at them. So I get them once in a while, I'll see, oh, I've got an exception tracker for customer A doing so-and-so, and then I'll look and I'll think, oh, I better check in and see what's going on. Why are they getting this problem? So I find that kind of it's not really proactive, but I mean, at least real time knowing there's a problem really helps, and it comes directly to me, because most of my clients are, don't necessarily have their own IT staff to be caring or looking or knowing what this means. So I really like I like it so much I built this package for myself to put in all my clients, because it just makes it so easy. You have a logging object, you can report on it, you can do whatever you want that Salesforce can do for you. So, I mean, you see people that just catch the exception, and what do they do in the exception? They do that, nothing. I mean, you can do that and it won't bomb, but you'll never know that something happened or didn't happen. So I don't think that's the best option. I think that's kind of the easy way out for someone who isn't responsible for the data quality at the end of the day. So yeah, so watch out for that.
And with that, we're at the end. What are you planning to solve with Asynchronous Apex? Comment below. We would also love to hear what video topics you want us to cover in future videos in the comments. If you've made it to this point, we want to take an opportunity to say thank you. Since you've stayed with us, here's a bonus. Many business requirements can be accomplished asynchronously, so the user does not have to wait around. Always consider asynchronous or synchronous when designing solutions. And if you choose asynchronous, think about exception handling, since no one will be watching the screen to see the error pop up. Queueable is your friend. Always consider this before future. Thank you for spending time with us. Please like and subscribe to our channel, because we share weekly content to support your tech and Salesforce learning journey. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss a new video. We also handpick these videos which we recommend you watch next. Connect with us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and on 100daysoftrailhead.com, all of which are listed below. Thank you for learning with us, and we'll see you back tomorrow.